This podcast is about the second President of the United States, John Adams, and the events that took place during his administration. In 1792, Washington won unanimous re-election as president. Many wanted him to be president for life. But in 1796, Washington decided to retire from public life. This set an important precedent that the presidency should not be a lifelong office. Because Washington served only 2 terms, American presidents in the future would follow this 2-term precedent. It lasted all the way till 1940 when the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, ran for and won a historic 3rd term. In Washington's farewell address, he warned the nation about the dangers of partisan politics and organized political parties. He also warned the nation about entering into permanent alliances with other countries. Washington thought the United States needed to stay out of the conflicts and wars that ravaged Europe. And because of this, he thought that the nations should stay out of permanent alliances. If you look at the election map of 1796, it was the first contested election. And you can already see that America is divided along sectional lines. The North was filled with urban artisans and manufacturers and financiers and banks. And therefore, they very much favored the Federalist policies and therefore voted for the candidate John Adams, who was the Federalist. The South, on the other hand, was dominated by planters and farmers, and they favored the Republican policies and therefore voted for Thomas Jefferson. This is something in American politics known as sectionalism, when you are loyal to the interests of your own region. John Adams had the most electoral votes and therefore became president. But in 1796, electors cast 2 ballots for president, and whoever took second place became vice president. This was not an ideal situation because you had a president, John Adams, who was a Federalist, and a vice president, Thomas Jefferson, who was a Republican, both from different parties. But remember, when the founders were writing the Constitution, they were not thinking about the spread of organized political parties. So in 1804, the Constitution was changed with the 12th Amendment, so that now the president and the vice president would be elected on separate ballots. During the Adams administration, war continued between Britain and France. When U.S. officials were sent to France to meet with French officials, the French officials asked for a bribe. Adams decided to publicize this event, and it became known as the XYZ affair. Americans were furious, and anti-French sentiment spread throughout the country. A South Carolina congressman summed it up best when he toasted millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. Tribute was when you gave someone money as a sign of respect or submission, that they were better than you. And what he's saying here is, we'll spend millions on defense to build up our military, but we're not going to give you 1 cent, you French officials, to meet with you. The United States and France entered into a quasi-war. This is where 2 countries don't actually declare war. So even though the French and the United States governments had not declared war on one another, their ships were battling it out on the seas. This brought the American government closer to being allies with Britain. And in 1800, finally, the Adams administration would finally make peace with France. In 1798, during this quasi-war, the Adams administration and the Federalist-dominated Congress passed 2 very controversial laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts. They were aimed at silencing immigrants and Republicans. Immigrants now faced the threat of being deported if they were labeled enemies by the federal government. Republican newspapers were now threatened because the Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the government or government officials. Jefferson and Madison thought that these acts violated the First Amendment rights of the Constitution, so they drafted 2 documents, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, meant to be passed by those states' legislatures. Jefferson took it a step further and argued the political theory of nullification. That was that a state had the right to invalidate a federal law if the state believed the law was unconstitutional. So if a state did not think that a federal law was unconstitutional, the state would just not enforce that law within its borders. This was the idea of nullification. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a man named John Marshall. He was a Federalist, and John Marshall's decisions strengthened the power of the federal government. In the landmark decision of Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall set up a policy called judicial review. Judicial review means that the Supreme Court was going to decide on the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress. So the power of the Supreme Court to determine the constitutionality of a law passed by Congress is judicial review. So Jefferson had argued that a state could determine on the constitutionality of a law. John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison is saying, no, it's the power of the Supreme Court to determine whether or not a law is constitutional or not. The latest example of this, and a highly publicized example, would be the July 2012 Supreme Court ruling on the Affordable Care Act. If you look, there you can see the Roberts Rules issue of Time magazine. The Supreme Court had to determine whether or not parts of the Affordable Care Act were constitutional, and the court decided by one vote that it was constitutional. Unfortunately for America, Jefferson's idea of nullification and states' rights continued to plague the country in the years leading up to the Civil War. Alexander Hamilton, the leading Federalist, was shot and killed in 1804 in a duel with then-sitting Vice President Aaron Burr. Although Alexander Hamilton was dead, many people believe the ghost of Alexander Hamilton lived on in John Marshall's Supreme Court case rulings, which continued to strengthen the power of the federal government.